Good morning from the Wilson Center Canada Institute, and welcome to this virtual discussion on Canada and NATO. My name is Xavier Delgado. I am a research coordinator and analyst at the Institute, and I'm joined here today by two of our finest global fellows. Lindsay Rodman is a Canada Institute Global Fellow and recently served as the Executive Director of the Leadership Council for Women in National Security. She is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, where she served as judge advocate for 8 years on active duty. She's held positions at the National Security Council, the Pentagon, and the Council of Foreign Relations, where she was the inaugural International Affairs Fellow in Canada. She is a double graduate from Harvard with degrees from the Law School and the Kennedy School, as well as a graduate of Duke University. Go Blue Devils. Dr. Andrea Charron is also a Canada Institute Global Fellow and an expert in Canadian defense policy. She's written extensively on the Arctic, NORAD, and the Security Council. She is currently Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba, but previously worked for several federal departments, including the Privy Council Office and the Security and Intelligence Secretariat. Dr. Charron, welcome. We're going to proceed to our questions now, and I have a question for both of you to open the floor. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau once bemoaned that in the 2 decades following the establishment of NATO, Canada, and I quote here, had no defense policy except that of NATO. Today, with a younger Trudeau in power, Canada faces criticism for allowing defense procurement and investments into critical security infrastructure, like the Northern Warning System, to stagnate. Do you think that Pierre Trudeau's comments on Canadian defense policy held merit in the 1960s? And do you think they hold merit today? Dr. Charron, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think there are definite echoes of circumstances for both Trudeaus. Namely, there was a war that changed minds. There were certainly economic pressures, and I think in both cases, a growing appreciation for the role of NATO and, in today's context, NORAD. So Trudeau, I think, thought that NATO was really a relic of the 1950s. It probably didn't help that the European Economic Community was making it very difficult for Canada to get trade deals. Trudeau was of the opinion that Europe was recovering and Canadian troops were needed at home. And so in one of his many pirouette moves, he cut support to NATO by nearly a half in 1969. But the 1973 Arab-Israeli war sort of changed his mind. At the time, there was incredible stagflation, and he then doubled the defense budget between 1976 and 1984 to $8.7 billion at the time, including buying Leopard tanks and also allowing for cruise missile testing in Canada. Today, I think we're facing incredible pressures from NATO allies to contribute the 2%. I think similarly to Trudeau Sr., I think our current Prime Minister is starting to appreciate the value of NATO and NORAD and the importance of investing in both. And I think the war in Ukraine has certainly sharpened minds. And so I think it's difficult to criticize both given the changing circumstances. Both defense policies have similar goals: Canada first, then North America, then the international community. Time will tell in the case of Justin Trudeau, but yeah.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you, Andrea. Lindsay, what are your thoughts? Do you think those comments held merit back then? Do you think they hold merit now, especially with, as Andrea said, with the war in Ukraine and the future of Canadian defense spending?
Yeah, so I had the opportunity, as you mentioned in the bio, to do embed in Canada in both the Department of National Defense and Global Affairs Canada when I was on the first ever Council on Foreign Relations fellowship in Canada. And it was really fascinating to me to see the way that policy sort of manifested in Canada in ways that were surprising to me as an American observer. And I had a couple of observations there. So one is that the quote, and I remember that quote, it appears twice actually in the book because it's so noteworthy and kind of like really makes you think. And the quote is actually, I'm going to spell out the ... in there. The quote is actually, "We had no defense policy, so to speak, except that of NATO, and our defense policy had determined all of our foreign policy. And we had no foreign policy of any importance except that of NATO." And what was interesting to me there is that, Canada's foreign policy, it seems, is much more sort of important from a Canadian perspective than the defense policy, because that national security imperative doesn't manifest in the minds of daily Canadians as much as, for example, trade, which really does have a role in the domestic conversation and in domestic politics to a more outsized amount than, for example, in the United States, where I would argue it would be flipped. So that was really interesting as an observation. And so this question that he was observing that in the 1960s, defense was driving foreign policy for Canada, I can see that being alarming for a leader, given sort of the real threats and what the priorities may be from a domestic politics perspective. So that was noteworthy and interesting to me. And I do think that I don't see that being true today. I don't see defense policy on like a sort of foreign level being outsized as compared with the Canadian perspective on foreign policy. I think now there's much more of a foreign policy is driving defense policy. And I think that's right. In the United States, we've struggled with prioritizing defense and using, in the words of Rosa Brooks, sort of the military becomes everything and becomes the tool with which to enact your foreign policy, even in areas where it may not be best suited. So there, I think maybe we're not quite where we used to be. Another observation, though, that I had when I was living in Canada was that the defense policy conversation was almost exclusively about defense procurement. And in the US, we never talk about it in that way. Procurement is its own thing. It's like off in a bubble. People who do procurement don't do policy in our parlance, right? You've got the policy shop in the Department of Defense that does the sort of international relations component of policy, as well as things like cyberspace, developing capabilities. And then you've got the defense industrial base and procurement and what are we going to buy to facilitate that policy. But those are very separate and siloed conversations. And the people who are expert in procurement usually shy away from this conversation we're having right now about like, what is NATO and what is it supposed to do and what is Canada's role in it? And vice versa, the people who do the quote policy side of the house in the American parlance don't know stuff about procurement. So they're like, I don't know how many tanks we bought. That's not a part of the conversation. So it is really interesting getting that Canadian perspective where those two come very much hand in hand. And I think part of what that quote really gets to is that Canadians have not divorced the two, that the conversation about defense policy and defense procurement tend to be the very same conversation. And at times it may actually lead to a healthier conversation to really be thinking about those things separately and thinking about procurement as a way to serve policy as opposed to the be all and end all of the policy.
Absolutely. And thank you for the context and illustrating the differences between the Canadian and US system and approach to doing things. I think it's important for our American and our Canadian listeners to understand the difference between how each government approaches and frames looking at defense. And
can I just add that I think while we talk about NATO as the driving force of the defense policy, then really it's about the United States. And for Canada and successive prime ministers, it's making that juggling act between being a really good ally of the United States, but not to be seen to be led by the United States. And so that was one of the concerns of Pierre Trudeau, that if you are too invested in NATO, that we're also too invested in perhaps US policy as well. And so we're always trying to make that balance. And it's what, Joel Sokolsky and Joseph Jockle argued is finding those suspenders and a belt. So having that allegiance to NATO, because it can be also a bulwark to being too invested in US defense policy. And then NORAD, which is again, sort of the belt. At times, NORAD is a solution to having to do too much for European allies. And so Canadian prime ministers have often treated NATO and NORAD as separate. I think the difference is today that we're starting to realize that we need to consider them together, and that investment in NORAD, for example, is investment in NATO.
Dr. Charron, thank you for bringing that up. And you've actually written extensively about NORAD and the Arctic. So I want to turn to that very briefly and talk about NATO's approach to the Arctic, because it is right in Canada's backyard, and NATO hasn't always been aligned in how to approach the Arctic as a theater of operation. Your contribution to a book called Turning the Tide, How to Rescue Transatlantic Relations, published in 2020, outlined why major NATO members like the United Kingdom, France, and Germany have resisted framing the Arctic as the strategic theater of operation for the alliance. Does Russia's belligerence in Eastern Europe and its capacity to inflict damage through air, land, and sea and cyberspace activities in the Arctic change that calculus for NATO?
Well, I think, for example, Norway has been trying to change NATO's calculus on the Arctic for many years now. It's why they've often championed the largest NATO exercises. In fact, Cold Response is just about to finish on April 1st, and it's led by Norway off the coast of Norway. So I think Norway has been trying to get especially the United States to think more deeply about their capabilities in the US. And now we're seeing, almost too much attention to the Arctic in some cases, because we've had every US service now has an Arctic strategy, but we still don't have an understanding of the US foreign policy vis-a-vis the Arctic. And what the aggression of Russia in Ukraine has now done is sort of sharpen minds as to whether or not NATO needs an Arctic strategy, because Russia, of course, fronts half of the Arctic Ocean. And if there was going to be any spillover, it might happen in an Arctic context. And so I think NATO right now is struggling with that, including other competing pressures. And it's also being driven by the US focus on what we call joint all-domain command and control. So not only worrying about where there could be regional conflicts, but also, do we have the capabilities to understand what's happening in all the domains, including, under the water, on the land, in the air, in space, in the cyber world? And can we take advantage of the fact that we have these allies and partners that we can draw from and benefit from in terms of information and capabilities?
Absolutely. And Lindsay, you've also written fairly extensively on the Arctic. Do you want to give us your 2 cents on the topic?
Sure. So it's funny that you mention the UK, France, and Germany having resisted the Arctic, because most recently, Canada was one of the players who was most resistant to the Arctic coming into the NATO conversation. And the reason there, my understanding, was just this sense of actually keeping NATO at arm's length, right? That NATO's mission was really about Europe and the North Atlantic, and inviting an Arctic conversation was really inviting NATO into Canada itself. And, sort of defense against help type justification for keeping NATO away. So there was, interestingly, a Canadian interest in not having the Arctic conversation. I think at this point that sort of dissipated, mostly because global geopolitics have necessitated having that conversation, or at some point you can be pushing against the trend too much. And so I think we're sort of there where NATO is having that conversation. I mean, certainly the Secretary General of NATO is having very explicit conversations about the Arctic. In part, the other reason that the Arctic was not a part of the NATO conversation was because Russia really loves to regard itself as the Arctic hegemon. And in terms of Arctic capability, Russia is a leader. I think I would put Canada as a leader there too, although Canada doesn't usually champion itself as a leader globally on many things for sort of Canadian cultural reasons, I think, among others. For for NATO to say we operate in the Arctic would have been provocative for the Russians. I think now we don't care because they've provoked so massively that, we're not on good terms anymore. So it's okay to have a more explicit conversation about operating in the Arctic. But, you asked about Russia's belligerence and Russia's capabilities in the Arctic, and the belligerent part, I think they've shown that they're willing to be belligerent in a way that we all had hoped was not the case. But the threat in the Arctic is still not easy to articulate. The threat through the Arctic, in terms of the strategic approach that Russia would most likely take to threaten North America, is, I think, kind of obvious. But it's hard to see from even the way that the US services are articulating their Arctic strategies, which are weird, by the way, right? It is weird that each individual American service has an Arctic strategy, but there isn't an overarching national strategy, except for the one from 2013 that really helps us coherently understand what they're trying to do under a rubric of foreign policy. But even so, they've gotten this memo, especially because of pressure from the US Congress, that they need to care about Arctic security, but not necessarily precisely why. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops over the coming years. Last thing I would mention is the Northern Sea Route. And that is really where potential tension, where I think there's the source of potential tension in the medium term, right? And medium term, I'm defining like 10 to 15 years. It's not usable right now, so it doesn't matter. But a lot of the way that Russia's posturing itself could predictably be creating some problems in terms of international law and sort of global commons and the way that Russia regards its, quote, ownership of the Northern Sea Route.
I would extend it into what we call the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, which traditionally during the Cold War time was a focus for NATO. We got away from that, and we see a re-attention to that in the form of the Second Fleet and Joint Force Command Norfolk. And because it is sort of the entryway from the Arctic into the North Atlantic, I think you're going to see increased attention there. And certainly that's where Norway wants NATO to practice. The last thing I'll say is it's interesting that NATO is taking a very different approach to the Arctic, in that rather than all NATO states, please come join us in the Arctic, they're being far more strategic and saying, let's concentrate on those NATO states with Arctic capabilities, because as we know, it's very difficult to operate in the Arctic, and now is not a time to have NATO allies who don't have those capabilities to be operating in the Arctic, because the real concern is that accidents, misperceptions, or incidents are going to escalate things really quickly.
While we're on the topic of NATO expanding into other areas, and by the way, a great description of the issues and the threats in the Arctic. Thank you both for that. I want to bring it back a little bit and talk about general NATO expansion outside of Eastern Europe. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the idea of NATO's pivot to other theaters beyond Europe began to circulate. For example, Article 5 was invoked for the first and only time when the United States was attacked on September 11th. And NATO leaders have increasingly mentioned China, which is trying to assert itself as a near Arctic state, in formal declarations, most recently after the Brussels summit in June 2021. But now Russia's invasion of Ukraine has seemed to redirect NATO's attention back to Europe for the time being. So what do you think about the prospects of the alliance expanding its focus beyond Europe and into other theaters, possibly the Indo-Pacific or the Arctic, or possibly even space, which we'll get into later? Dr. Charron, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. I think NATO has already started to make that shift. NATO now has a space center that is headquartered in Allied Air Command. In 2021, NATO confirmed that any sort of incident in space could be grounds for Article 5. We know that Estonia is the cyber experts, and they have a center of excellence. And I know that Canada wants to create one that's focused on climate change. With regard to the Indo-Pacific, I think especially now, given events in Ukraine, NATO will be very circumspect about doing a full pivot to the Indo-Pacific region. I think it's far more likely that you're going to see other arrangements of partners like the Quad that involves Japan, Australia, the US, and India, to focus on the Indo-Pacific, because the real concern that NATO has had whenever it went out of area is that it gets overextended. And rather than a little bit of NATO everywhere, I think they're seeing the importance of being strategic and making sure that they are able to shore up places of concern, such as in the GI-UK gap along Eastern Europe, and to also strengthen the North American pillar of NATO, which involves both the US and Canada to invest in what they call NORAD modernization.
Lindsay, Rodman, before we come to you about space, because I know you have a forthcoming piece on NATO and space, I just wanted to touch a little bit on the Indo-Pacific. Andrea, you mentioned the Quad, which is primarily led by the United States as well as with regional allies. Canada, which is a major Pacific state, has notably been left out of that. Lindsay, do you think that's a big vulnerability for Canada, or do you think we need to invest more in our security relationship with the United States and regional allies in the Indo-Pacific theater?
Yeah, it was really interesting to me last fall when the nuclear sub deal between Australia and the United States was disclosed and France got mad, justifiably. I was talking to Canadian colleagues and they were also sort of a little dismayed that they were not a part of that conversation. And I will admit that I was very surprised because, my first reaction was to be like, you want nuclear subs in the Pacific? Like Canada, you want that? And the answer was like, oh, no, we definitely don't. And I'm like, okay. So why should you have been at the table for that conversation? Right. And there's this sense in Canada that's like, well, we really want a seat at the table. Like we want to be there. And I totally get it. But there really isn't an appetite in Canada to be operating at that level. So certainly not to be purchasing new nuclear submarines, but really not even to be expending significant Canadian resources patrolling the Pacific with the naval assets that Canada already does have. I think the narrative is more that they're stretched in terms of the North Atlantic and Arctic missions potentially. So I'm not seeing real will on the part of Canada to participate. But it is interesting as Canada's relationship with China sort of becomes more of a focal point domestically, sort of like what does Canada want its relationship with China to be, and what kind of potentially adversarial posture on certain issues is Canada willing to take with respect to China. Then an adversarial might be too strong a word, but really sort of, what does Canada want its relationship with China to look like on the good and bad side? On medium side, the types of alliances like the Quad may feel like a home that Canada wants to be a part of. And I know it's hard from a Canadian perspective to hear this, but Canada's interest in sitting at that table it's not easy to articulate sort of like why Canada should be sitting at that table right now. And I hate saying that because it sounds mean, but so I do think that there's some introspection that Canada needs to do about what it wants its role to be in the Pacific. I think the United States has always and would always welcome a more proactive engagement in the Pacific, but I don't think this is one of those circumstances where the US is wagging its finger at Canada saying you need to get more engaged right now. I think the door is open and Canada has not shown any interest in walking through the door. But that AUKUS deal was the first time that I think Canada saw that there might be a consequence to not being sort of not looking westward and seeing what opportunities and what threats and needs might need to be met there.
Andrea, you're nodding your head. It seems like you agree with what Lindsay is saying.
Yeah, I just don't think we have the capacity to be able to be both, a good NATO ally, focus on NORAD, which is essential, but also the fact that the Canadian Armed Forces has 50% of its missions are with assistance to the province and the territories in natural disasters and things like the COVID pandemic. I can't imagine shifting to the Indo-Pacific given current personnel and capability limits, because you can't just dab your toe into the Indo-Pacific. You have to be all in. And that means having the intelligence capabilities, having the operational capabilities, having the extra personnel, because those other priorities are not going away. And the first responsibility is always Canada first, and then North America, and then international stability. And the last thing we want to be is, again, too overstretched where we're not really helping anymore. And then it leaves, especially North America, vulnerable. And then all our allies and partners have to pivot to come into the rescue of North America. That's the last thing we want.
Great points. And I have one more question on the Indo-Pacific before we move on to a different theater of operation. Article 2 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which founded NATO, and actually was a Canadian contribution to the treaty, reads, the parties will contribute towards the further development of peaceful and friendly international relations by strengthening their free institutions, by bringing about a better understanding of the principles upon which these institutions are founded, and by promoting conditions of stability and well-being. They will seek to eliminate conflict in their international economic policies and will encourage economic collaboration between any or all of them. Andrea, in a review of Canada and NATO, 1949 to 2019, published in 2020, you note that although, quote, Canada ultimately failed to expand NATO beyond a purely military alliance, Article 2 may yet become useful as a bulwark against China's influence and economic domination. Can you expand on that notion and how Article 2 could be useful when they expand into new theaters like the Indo-Pacific?
Well, first, I would encourage everybody to get Canada and NATO and read the section on Article 2, because Canada was absolutely dogged in, thank you, Lindsay, in making sure that Article 2 was included, because in many ways we were guarding against the dumbbell model that seemed to be preferred by the US. And we also wanted to keep the O in organization. We didn't want this to be just a series of sort of bilateral deals. I think that, Article 2 is going to be increasingly important because we now realize that international trade can also be weaponized and is part of the calculus of military strategic stability. And in NATO, we have 1 billion people. And that is a pretty good counter to China's billion consumers. And if we used and took advantage of Article 2, we could, for example, be strengthening sanctions against Russia, because right now we do it autonomously. So Canada puts it in place, the US puts it in place, EU puts it in place, but we also have, not all NATO allies are EU partners, so we could have additional assistance there, as the UK is doing. But going further, there are opportunities for us to have NATO economic deals, which then make us far less dependent on, Russia for oil and gas in the future and China for imports and exports.
Absolutely. Lindsay, do you have any thoughts on that before we move on?
I mean, I do commend the book to everyone, and no one's paying us to say that right now. It was really interesting to reflect back on that being the Canadian contribution, and really sort of thinking about Canada's leadership early on in NATO and the vision that Canadian diplomats had for what the potential for the organization would be. It would be very interesting to see NATO really embrace it. I agree with Andrea, there's an opportunity there. I think it would take a lot of diplomacy, and no one's there right now to operationalize Article 2. Like, I don't think that's a thing that they've talked about thus far. But it has been something that has hamstrung NATO. So, China and the Huawei network and 5G coming from China has been a real limiter of the US, inhibitor, I guess is the better word, is a real word, to the US being able to operate interoperably with European allies. And so in some ways, I think think, the facilitating European economic cooperation is one thing, but also shoring up North American and European cooperation and preventing potential threats from manifesting such that they actually prevent our ability to operate interoperably. I'll share a story where I still am in the reserves, and I belonged to NATO for 3 years. I was drilling one day at Allied Command Transformation, and this corporal runs in and he says, "Does anyone have a Huawei charger?" And we were like, "What? No, of course not." And one of the generals, I will not say from which country, but a European country, had a Huawei phone and it died and no one could charge it. And we're just like, what is the general doing with a Huawei phone? We're sitting in Norfolk, Virginia, being like, how did we get here, right? And no, we don't have a charger for that phone. And no, get it off of this campus, right? There are issues that we still have that this could be a really useful tool for. But diplomatically, we're not quite there yet. It's a great idea, but I don't think that we're it's going to happen tomorrow.
Absolutely, and that
Oh, sorry.
is important. Sorry,
I was just going to add too, we're also in an age where nationalism and populism is sort of taking over. Article 2 is also a good guard against that. The more we're interdependent on trade relationships, it is a bit of a resistance to national tendencies, which, the foundation of NATO, I keep saying NORAD, foundation of NATO is on democratic principles. And so this is Article 2 is the one thing we can point to say, here's the reminder that we need this.
Absolutely, and a great point, Andrea, and a great anecdote, Lindsay, on Huawei. I think most Canadians know that Canada is most likely going to ban Huawei networks, and especially in the aftermath of the 2 Michaels case, China showed that it can bully NATO allies and seemingly get away with it without major repercussions to economic relations. Huawei is still very popular in Europe amongst NATO allies, despite Canada's involvement in the organization and its history with China. I want to take this to a different theater, in space, which Andrea mentioned earlier. And Lindsay, you have a forthcoming piece titled "Armed Attacks in Space" that will appear in the NATO Legal Gazette.
It's actually already published. It came out last summer, so you can read it.
Congratulations. There you go. Everybody go read Lindsay's piece. But as a little precursor to that, in the Alliance's words, space is a dynamic and rapidly evolving area, which is essential to the Alliance's deterrence and defense. Can you speak to your piece and outline the threats that NATO members face in space and shed some light on how the Alliance is approaching space as an operational domain?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Andrea's last comments were a perfect segue, because the issue in space is that question of interdependence, right? That right now, and it's not just interdependence among nations that are cooperating with each other, but it's also interdependence between civilian and military infrastructure, where basically everything in space is dual use. A lot of even American military capability is riding on civilian assets. And so what that means is that it's all lashed up together in really problematic ways. And as we're talking about different domains of operation, space is really just an operating domain. So we talk about NATO expanding into space or expanding into cyber. I sort of push against that, because it's the modern day reality about what it means to defend the North Atlantic, right? I mean, the opposite would be to defend the North Atlantic with no cyber or space capability, which in modern day realities just doesn't make any sense. So I don't really think of it as an expansion. It's sort of, it's not that different than technological advancements within recognized domains already, right? I mean, we had surface ships and then we had submarines. They're both maritime, but they're like dramatically different capabilities that affect the security environment. And similarly, moving into other domains like cyber and space is really just an extension of what the NATO mission originally looked like. So in 2019, the Secretary General of UN announced that space would be an operational environment for NATO. And frankly, that was really late in the game. And it was, I don't know this, I don't know this personally from NATO people, but I was at Trident Juncture and in my capacity as a Marine. And I'm not speaking on behalf of the US Marine Corps, but I just want to make that clear. My comments are my own. But it was obvious during Trident Juncture that the lack of NATO space operating capability and focus on space was a vulnerability when it came to thinking about scenarios with Russia as an adversary. And in Trident Juncture, it's not Russia, it's a pretend country. Same thing with Cold Response. It's not Russia necessarily that we're fighting, but a lot of capabilities are similar. And I think you can extrapolate pretty credibly into, seeing the threat that's coming from Russia. NATO's doctrine when it comes to space operations dates back to 2016, and there hasn't been an update since NATO decided that it was going to operate in space. So that's also a problem. And the doctrine there really puts the onus on national capability. So the realities of operating in space as NATO right now means probably that the United States would actually use a national capability outside the rubric of NATO, do its space thing over here because NATO doesn't really have a well-developed way to do it, and then NATO would hopefully benefit from what the US is doing. That's not ideal from an alliance perspective, right? You really want to be able to do that in-house. And there is, Andrea mentioned the Space Center in Germany that has been stood up, but it really primarily is a liaison function. So it's a liaison to national capabilities, understanding that most space capability would be executed under national authority, not necessarily with NATO coming together. So I think there is a lot of work to be done in NATO trying to think about what does it mean for us to be working together when it comes to space. One of the biggest inhibitors there, I'm going really in the weeds on this, sorry, you got me going. One of the biggest inhibitors there is actually the classification level. So Canada is particularly well positioned as a Five Eyes nation, and because we collaborate so closely in NORAD, that if we're going to share with anyone, it's going to be Canada and probably the UK above other NATO allies. Sorry, other NATO allies who are watching, but I think you know the realities of Five Eyes and NATO's and American intelligence sharing. Space is classified at such a high level and really well compartmentalized that it's really, really hard to instigate true collaboration on that front. So I think one of the things that will facilitate that is other nations like Canada establishing space capabilities such that it makes sense for everyone to be working together, right? Like so that the Five Eyes really should be collaborating on this stuff because Canada's doing it, the US is doing it, so you both need to be read into what each other are doing. So that's kind of a payoff to Canada establishing its own capability. I mean, I'm totally agnostic about whether Canada needs a space force or anything like that, but just the capability, regardless of what it's called. So the article itself, for folks who may or may not want to go read it, it's legal. It's a law article. I'm an attorney, and it's really about the question of when is an attack in space an armed attack such that it would justify self-defense retaliation on land in the US, in the world. And so, it was interesting when NATO declared that an attack in space might threaten the territorial integrity of a NATO state such that Article 5 could be invoked, because it's actually a legal question whether an attack in space could manifest in that way. And I know we're talking really sort of, attack in space, what does that even mean? For lay people, what it probably means is civilian communications infrastructure, right? Like, and some navigation systems and some other systems that would affect sort of day-to-day life, ability for the military to operate for sure, but also civilian capabilities. So that's like the hook that you would have to use. You'd have to say, okay, so Russia shot down our navigation satellite, for example, that has its effect on military capability, but that also really threatens civilians and our ability to operate, and in some ways the territorial integrity of a NATO nation. In that case, could they then invoke Article 5 and say that there's an attack on us, so it's an attack on all? So it's sort of the legal links in the chain.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to reading that article now that I know that it's been released. I'm sure it's going to be absolutely great based on your response to that question. Andrea, do you have any thoughts on the topic before we move along?
No, but I mean, it's something that Canada always wrestles with. Our largest space capabilities are actually with a civilian agency, the Canadian Space Agency. And we were leaders in space. We were one of the first to launch a satellite, certainly the Canada Arm, people may have heard of, but we have RadarSat Constellation, which is really a game changer in terms of the pictures and the domain awareness we can have, especially in the North American Arctic. And so being able to knit and coordinate these pictures, which you have with the EU satellite system and then the US and some of Canada's pictures, again, we have an advantage being part of an alliance and having allies and partners. The trick is, as Lindsay alluded to, is actually sharing that information. And it is often things like classification protocols or assumptions about, well, this won't be of interest to them, that really sort of hamstrings us in our ability to get ultimately that all domain awareness picture. And it's also, a seam eraser for the US Unified Command Plan, which is starting to realize that they need to be globally integrated and share information, because in the past it would be whatever happens in EUCOM stays in EUCOM, and they wouldn't necessarily think that US Northcom had to be informed, or there might be unintended repercussions as a result of activity happening there. The great thing about the new thinking is that we need to share this information, and rather than the go-to compulsion to make something classified and then, why do you need to have this? We need to change it to, of course, you should have this, and only in exceptional circumstances should we be classifying this material so that allies can't have access.
Absolutely. Information sharing is so important. And as you both noted, Canada and the United States share a lot through the Five Eyes network, along with the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. I will note that with the AUKUS Security Pact with Australia, the UK, and the United States, some looked at that and thought, well, it's just Five Eyes without Canada and New Zealand, who have been left out. How can Canada ensure that, unlike in the Indo-Pacific, where AUKUS was established and Canada and New Zealand were cut out, possibly because they didn't walk through the open door that was left for them to engage in that theater, how can they ensure they're not being cut out of a shift to space for NATO, for instance, or shifts to other theaters to make sure that they're not the odd man out in those situations?
Well, I'll jump in and say that one key in space is this interdependence question, right? So we have, there's an increasing trend away from binding multilateral treaties in the international law world, which I lament. So those were great. They did a lot of good. The North Atlantic Treaty being, among one of the best examples. But it's really hard to get a multilateral treaty done anymore. And when you look at some of the problems in space, you see, a global commons that needs some kind of accountability and enforcement mechanism that would, decades ago been an obvious place where treaty law could help. And now we don't really see that as much of an option. And I think what has kind of taken its place, and this isn't great, is economic interdependence. And so you see, the way that Canada can take part is, one, I think we already mentioned sort of developing a space capability, in which case, Canada's got an obvious seat at the table. And Canada has a space capability, but, continuing to develop it and having it be at the level of the same players who Canada wants to be at the table with. But the other is actually investing in that interdependence and, riding on some of the same satellites and vice versa, launching satellites that help other nations with their capability. The US uses some of the radar stat and stuff that Canada has put up there, and vice versa. And I think that that's actually quite helpful, because it creates the imperative for that kind of information sharing and for Canada being at the table.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And that's that Article 2 again.
I have one more theater I want to cover before we start to bring this to a conclusion, and that's the Middle East, where NATO has been quite active. And Lindsay, as someone who was active in the Marine Corps, you actually were in Afghanistan. So I want to direct this question to you first, and then we'll go to Andrea. Chapter 8 of Canada and NATO, which we've held up and referenced before, describes how Canada's contributions in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2014 gave it an opportunity to step away from its Cold War status as the odd man out in an alliance dominated by European members. Now, the war in Afghanistan is effectively over after the US withdrawal and resurgence of the Taliban. into power in Kabul. So Lindsay, in addition to being an expert on national security, can you speak to your experience in Afghanistan as a member of the Marine Corps and tell us about Canada's involvement in the theater and the significance of its contributions through NATO at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was stationed in Helmand province, which is the province that's just to the west of Kandahar province. And Kandahar was a part of, for folks who aren't familiar with how we sort of operationally divided up Afghanistan, we turned it into a pizza and it was turned into 5 wedges. So regional command south was where Kandahar was, and then regional command southwest was where Helmand was. So we were adjacent to each other, but a part of different sort of national divisions. So RC West and RC North were sort of known to be the kind of not too bad places. And then depending on whether you're in the Marine Corps or the Canadian Army, you fight about whether Kandahar was harder fighting or Helmand was harder fighting. And RC East also saw a fair amount of kinetic activity. And so it was very meaningful. You know, I would obviously argue that RC Southwest is the hardest corps of all of them, but it was very, very meaningful that Canada raised its hand and took the mission in Kandahar right off the bat. And that was a very, there was a lot of fighting happening there. And in the Marine Corps, we would say, you know, great leaders run to the point of friction. And Canada ran to the point of friction. And that, so I think that that is to be commended. The other thing that Canada did that was very important was not stressed as much in this book, but has been stressed by Steve Sademan in his book, is the lack of caveats that Canada came into the fight in Afghanistan with. So folks who, and this is, I probably care about it because I'm a lawyer, but caveats are limits that troop contributing nations put on the way that their troops can be used. So for example, some of the troops that were used in RC North and RC West were like, yeah, we want to be there, but we don't really want to do combat, which of course was the whole point. And so, you know, those contributions were meaningful because they freed up other forces to be doing other things. So for example, the US didn't have a lot of folks in North or West because other nations were taking on those roles. So that was helpful in terms of freeing up capacity. But of course, like, you know, the most meaningful contributions were the people, and really the Brits and the Canadians were the only true examples of this, but there were other really, really meaningful contributions from other European nations, even if they had very small caveats, where they said, we want to play, put us in where you need us. And so that was great. And Canada chose Kandahar, right? Like it wasn't, the US wasn't sort of directing that, but that was a meaningful contribution. So I think Canadians have a lot to be really, really proud of in terms of not just the performance, which I think was exemplary. It was hard fighting, and I don't think any of us got it perfect, or else we would have seen maybe a different outcome in Afghanistan. A lot of that was strategic, though, not about the quality of the contributions. So not just about the decision to go, but also not just about how Canada fought, but also about the decision to go. I think merits a lot to be appreciated. The other half of it is that, you know, Canada and the rest of the world and the United States, we all suffer from this, tend to have two sort of conflicting views about the fight in Afghanistan and whether NATO was truly in charge of it, right? And so on the one hand, there was the sense that it is a NATO-led operation, in which case it should be NATO in charge. You know, everyone's got 1/30th of the fight to some extent. And you know, that it's a NATO mission, which means that we sort of embrace the idea that NATO should be there. In which case, the idea that one can pull out before the fighting is done is sort of, you know, like tough. And I think that Canada's withdrawal from Afghanistan before we were done put more onus on the United States. So I was there in 2010 and 2011. And when I left, I was replaced by another Marine division. I was there with the Marine division as their operational law attorney. At the same time, the Canadians were rotating out and they were replaced by the US Army. The fighting did not stop because Canada decided to stop fighting. And I think what we saw most recently when the US decided to unilaterally pull out of Afghanistan, and NATO allies were pretty upset about that, I think justifiably so, because it was a NATO-led mission and the United States just decided it was done without going to the North Atlantic Council and having a real conversation about it. You know, it's hard because the signaling had been there since 2014 from Canada, but also from other nations, that they were done, right? And so like, and so they were sort of acquiescing to the idea that it was a US-led mission, not a NATO-led mission, even though we called it a NATO-led mission, because you wouldn't do that if it were really a NATO-led mission. So I think we've got kind of this circularity in terms of what we mean when we say NATO-led, Afghanistan was NATO-led or Afghanistan was US-led. So I do think there's something complicated there about NATO's leadership in Afghanistan and Canada's contribution to it at a political level and what it means and the symbolism there. And I hope we can have that conversation while also acknowledging how meaningful the contribution that Canada made to the fight.
I hope so as well. And thank you for sharing both your insight and your experience from Afghanistan. That's a great quote. Great leaders run to the point of friction. That's definitely a takeaway that I've got it written down right here. That one's going to stick with me. Andrea, do you have any thoughts before we move to closing comments?
Well, I would just add that while we may run to the point of friction, it's because we have the approval of the Canadian public at home that this is what we want to do. And this is something that NATO always has to wrestle with. It's not just consensus among the 30 states, but it's somehow getting consensus among 30 different populations with different understandings of the role the military plays and what it should play in any conflict situation. And I think this is reflected in how Joel and JJ really try to analyze Canada in NATO. So rather than dwelling on, what was the effect of Afghanistan and the personalities and the mistakes that were made, it looks at, again, why is Canada part of NATO? And part of the reason is because we are sovereign states and we do have that vote. And can ultimately decide how we will contribute. This is not unlike the US coalitions of the billing and the willing. So, some of the NATO allies are happy to just send money, others are able to send troops. We're going to see more and more of those conversations. And this is why it's so important that, Canadians understand the roots and history and role of NATO, because they are a driver of decisions. And if they don't understand NATO's ultimate role and goal, then it's going to limit the ability of politicians to make those decisions at NATO as part of an alliance.
Absolutely. The political factor is so important. And speaking of Parliament, I want to close on this thought, and I'll give you both a chance to comment on this with current events. Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada and the Minister of Finance, recently announced that the Canadian government will deliver its budget on April 7th. And like many other NATO allies, Canada has fallen short of its 2006 commitment to spend 2% of its GDP on defense. It was one of President Trump's biggest points of criticism when he would meet with Prime Minister Trudeau. But recent developments in Europe have pushed some European allies to bolster security spending, and early indications show that they will likely meet that 2% commitment. Do you think we'll see a boost to Canada's defense budget on this cycle, possibly to 2% of its GDP? And is that going to be a larger implication of Canadian defense priorities going forward? Andrea, since we started with you first, I'm going to go to Lindsay to opening the closing remarks.
So I had I would have answered this way anyway, but I had the benefit of watching Joel Skolsky and JJ Jockel's discussion of their book on the Wilson Center website from last week. And they both were like, yeah, definitely not. So I'm gonna crib from them, but I think this is right, that like there's no way. Canada came out with its defense policy, Strong, Secure, Engaged, about 5 years ago. And, in the 20-year plan, in a written document that was meant to signal not just to Canadians, but I think to everyone looking on what Canada plans to spend in as forward-leaning a way as they were willing to write on paper. And I think they got up to like most 1.4 in the next 20 years. So even if there were a dramatic increase by those standards, we're not going to get anywhere close to 2.0. So what do we do with that? And I think that there are a couple of observations there. One, I think Canada might get to skate a little bit, because if all the European allies actually start taking their commitment to getting to 2%. And again, this is not anything that's being imposed on Canada. Canada committed to this in 2014 explicitly as part of the Whale Summit, and previously with less explicit statements. So this is a thing that Canada said it will do. And so there is some frustration, I think, from the American perspective that there's just like no straight-faced interest in from Canada in actually getting there. But I think some of the other allies who have also frustrated the United States are now showing that they really will get to 2% potentially in the medium term. And that may take some of the pressure off of Canada, because of course, the question is really like, is the alliance as a whole prepared to defend itself? And if, you know, some other allies are capable of doing that, and Canada is sort of saying like, we're not really threatened right now, you know, I think there may be some less pressure due to that. But Canada may see itself as the odd man out once again, odd country out, because of that as well. The other thing is, you know, often, and this happens a lot in the book, and it happened in last week's event, the justification for Canada not getting to 2% is like, but we're awesome. And everything that we contribute is so awesome that you should not care that we're not paying 2%. And it is true that Canada is awesome. I will vouch for that. And it is true that everything that Canada contributes is of very high quality, very sophisticated. You know, Canada operates technically at a very high level. But a part of the defense spending, the logic of it, is the question of being strong at home, so that you don't need the help of the alliance, right? And so a lot of it is like, yeah, but Canada, if you can't defend yourself, and if the US has to worry about subsidizing your defense at home as well as in NATO, then there's really still vulnerability there. And that's not what the 2% is meant to do. The 2% is not about who can contribute to operations in Afghanistan. The 2% is about who can defend themselves at home, such that when the alliance has to come to your rescue as a part of an Article 5 mission, that you're contributing your fair share to your own defense. And that's where I think Andrea and I are totally aligned, because we need to start with NORAD modernization. And, you know, and some of the spending that I think Canada has been, you know, not prioritizing because the political will really isn't there to make it a strong priority, because the threat indications are not, you know, urgent blaring red alarm fires. You know, that's where I think some real serious thought should go into really funding where the need is. It's been very well identified by wonderful academics such as Andrea Charron, who's sitting right here, and you know, a worthy place for Canadians to focus.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And Andrea, with that glowing commendation, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I highly recommend Lindsay's work too. It's been really helpful to understand. It's always helpful to have an outsider, you know, reflect on Canada, because they can see things a little bit more clearly. In 2014 at the Whale Summit, when we made this pledge for the 2% of GDP and the 20% of research and development, and I want to separate those two. The 2%, we had 10 years. So technically we have until 2024. So in some ways, if you keep moving the goal, if we agree on 2024 and then you say, but you haven't done it yet, you know, hang on a moment, because in Strong, Secure, and Engage, we did say by 2026, we'd be getting close to $32 billion. And if our economy keeps shrinking, we'll get there for other reasons. Usually when cabinet makes these kind of decisions, they're given 3 decisions. 2 are throwaways and the 1 is the clear choice. It'll be interesting to see if the 3 choices given to cabinet on defense are status quo almost 2%, 2%, or status quo 2% beyond 2%. So how you frame it is going to matter. I think it's highly unlikely we would ever be above 2% because we have so many other competing pressures. But where I do think Canada needs more credit is on the 20% of research and development. Canada has done a lot, working on over the horizon backscatter radar, the RadarSat constellation, Polar Epsilon 2, helping with the AI Pathfinder initiative for the North Warning System. So we've been doing a lot on the research and development side, but nevertheless, we're still at 1.4% of GDP. If we do spend more, I hope that we don't start, sprinkling little bits here, there, and everywhere. it's quite clear that the president of the US, successive presidents of the US and Justin Trudeau promised that continental defense and NORAD modernization was the priority. And we certainly need that, as Lindsay says, to make sure that we have awareness of what's happening in our own country, so that then we have more options in terms of what we do in a NORAD context or in the bilateral context. We also need to work more, and something I don't think we spend enough on nor calculate is the different civilian agency contributions to defense. And we need to pay more attention to that. And we also need to make sure that we are able to have not just the Canadian Armed Forces operating, but that we really have whole of Canadian, whole of society efforts. I think one of the biggest contributions is if Canadians themselves could become more resilient when it comes to dealing with natural disasters, and not depend on civilian agencies and the military to come in. The last point, though, is we got to be careful what we wish for, because even if we can get to 2% of GDP, I am not confident at all we can spend that money. And that's because our procurement record is disastrous, to put it lightly. And our forces have been hemorrhaging personnel. So, in order to spend money and to grow the military, you need people there to be able to train and recruit and, start, for example, learning on new airframes to be able to bring them in and train the mechanics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we have been so depleted and running on empty for so long. And we have a disastrous procurement record. I'm a little bit worried that even if we say we're going to spend 2% of GDP, we're actually not going to be able to do that, in which case, then that's money that isn't supporting anything. And maybe in that case, it is better that it goes to healthcare, education, and all the other priorities.
And on that note, I want to thank both of you so much for joining us here today. All of us will be watching the announcement on April 7th to see if our predictions here came true. And I hope that all of you back home will be watching as well. If you like today's event, you can find it on the website shortly after this event concludes, where you can also find part 1 of this discussion with authors Joel Sokolsky and Joseph Jockel, as well as more of the work that Lindsay and Andrea have done for us at the Wilson Center. But for now, my name is Xavier Delgado with the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Wishing you all a great day. Thank you for joining us.